So the one thing that's quite new in the past couple of years is AI and ChatGPT, and we probably should do a podcast on this at some point, but where ChatGPT and AI sits in education and learning, and teaching ourselves, teaching in general. Can ChatGPT be a useful tool for preparing for interviews?
I think from my perspective, the short answer to that is yes, so long as it's used kind of intelligently, in a kind of savvy way. I think, again, in previous podcasts, we've said things like, using ChatGPT to write your personal statement is kind of dopey because you know far more about who you are and what you do and what your motivations are, for studying a subject than a bit of software does, even if it's a very powerful bit of software. So, using it for those parts of the admissions process, I mean, I'm sure people do. I just think it's really unwise. I think you do a better job doing that yourself. But for preparing for the interviews, I think it can potentially be very helpful, especially for people perhaps who are working in situations, studying in situations where, I don't know, their teachers aren't necessarily able to really focus on them and help them prepare for their interviews. I mean, some schools, are fortunate, they're quite wealthy and they have, large numbers of staff, and other schools aren't so wealthy and often have staffing issues. And so in some cases, it can certainly feel as if the applicants are sort of having to prepare themselves for their interviews. And that's fine. I think you can do that very well. And for the reasons I said earlier, often the people who haven't received so much formal training for the interviews do far better in the interviews because they respond more directly and things like that. But yeah, I mean, let's take a sort of, sciencey subject. Let's take a subject like maths. How can you use ChatGPT to sort of help you prepare for your maths interviews? Well, you can ask it to generate, 5 questions. You could say, at the sort of like first year university level. So again, a little bit beyond what you've been doing at school, but not crazy difficult. You can work your way through them and try and figure out at least what you'd need to know in order to be able to answer those questions. I mean, you may be able to answer them immediately, but if not, you might think, okay, say if it's about calculus, just to take that as an example, you might think, okay, the stuff that I've done so far about how to integrate, how to differentiate equations, I don't see how I can apply that in this case. This seems to be more complex. Maybe it's some type of differential equation that people hadn't seen. That's fine. What you can do then is take that as a starting point for understanding in more detail what you would need to know in order to be able to cope with it. And then you can spend a little bit of time. It almost becomes like a super curricular activity, finding out a little bit more about that slight sort of extension of the maths that you've been doing. And of course, with something like ChatGPT, you can then subsequently ask it to generate solutions to the questions it's given you. Now, again, I said earlier about skepticism, don't just trust the answers that it gives you. They may be absolutely correct. They may not be absolutely correct. This is where these systems still hallucinate, not infrequently. But even if it's incorrect, you should be able to convince yourself whether it's correct or not. So again, the onus should be on you. It's about an active intellectual engagement with that particular question or that particular set of questions, rather than just passively accepting what ChatGPT outputs. And so if through using it you become more intellectually engaged, that's bound to be good preparation for the interviews, because for the reasons we've said earlier, what the interviewers are hoping not to see in the interviews is just real intellectual passivity, just real kind of a lack of willingness to think.
And just for anyone who doesn't know, can you explain what hallucination is in AI and ChatGPT?
Yeah, so basically, because of the way these systems currently work, there aren't inbuilt fact-checking strategies. So if you ask something like ChatGPT a question about almost any topic, these days it is able to search online, so it can search, the web basically, and that can often lead it to responses that are more factually correct. But it's still possible, and it happens not infrequently, that the answers are just factually incorrect. If you ask it about, to suggest, I don't know, publications about a particular topic, if it generates 10, maybe 8 of them will be actual books about that topic, and 2 of them might just be completely made up. They might be quite similar to actual ones, but the names of the authors might be a bit different and things like this. So it just makes errors. And it can do that whatever topic it's being asked about. And so you should always use its outputs with an appropriate degree of skepticism. And as soon as you just passively accept its outputs, you're in danger.
Yeah.
But as soon as you stop doing that and start engaging intellectually with its outputs and trying to convince yourself whether you think that solution to this maths problem is correct or not, then you start engaging with it in precisely the same way that the interviewers want you to engage with their questions.
Yeah. I'm right in thinking, in general, kind of passively believing in, whether it's an interviewer or your peers or a text, passively believing in it without seeing if you actually believe in it or being critical of it can be an issue of in itself. But with ChatGPT, I'm right in understanding that ChatGPT is basically a guesser. It guesses, like its answers is a guess, and you wouldn't, if you're asking someone a question and they gave you a guess, you wouldn't believe them wholeheartedly. So you shouldn't believe ChatGPT in the same way.
I mean, it is kind of a guess. I mean, basically these systems work by associating. I mean, it converts everything into numbers. So even if it's trained on text, let's say English language text, it converts the words into unique numbers. So what it's really doing is learning how sequences of numbers relate to other sequences of numbers. And they may be words in English, they may be words in French, they may be mathematical symbols. It doesn't matter what they are. So, if it sees that, I don't know, I'm picking these numbers at random, if it sees that, the number 12 is often used in relation to the number 264, and that those things often go together, it will learn that association. And therefore, if asked about 12, it will output the other number. And when we sort of map that back to say, things in the English language, it may be that one of those numbers is Paris and one of those numbers is the Eiffel Tower. So it knows that the Eiffel Tower is in Paris simply because it knows that number is often mentioned when that other number's around. So those things really are closely associated. So if that counts as guessing, then it's kind of guessing, but it's recognizing those patterns, it's learning those patterns. And that's what enables it to produce outputs that are often, pretty convincing, but there is a lot of scope for it still to be flawed because, as I say, it's not as if it fact checks things every time before it generates the output. It's just learnt those patterns, and sometimes it learns the wrong patterns, or maybe you've asked it something that it hasn't seen a lot of training data on, so it's learnt fewer associations around that particular topic.
So another thing, so kind of going back to preparing for interviews and using ChatGPT, another thing that a lot of people are using ChatGPT for is to improve the understanding in a language they're learning, like in learning languages. And does ChatGPT have a place in preparing for MMO interviews or interviews when you're applying to study a language at Cambridge?
Yeah, again, I think used wisely, it can help. So the interviews will certainly involve some speaking in one of the languages. So obviously, it's usually a language someone has studied to usually A-level or equivalent standard. And there may also be an element of having to read a text in one of the foreign languages. And these are the sorts of things where, again, if used wisely, I think ChatGPT and the other big large language models can be useful. If you compare them to things like Google Translate, which people I think still use a bit, Google Translate, you'd put, say, the French in on one side and the English would come out the other. It would sometimes give you alternative translations that are just slightly different. And if you click on certain words, it would give you the kind of dictionary definition of what the word means. So you got some information, but the interface for Google Translate wasn't dialogue based. It was kind of a static, you put the input, it generated the output, and you couldn't then interrogate it about why it translated it in that way. With something like ChatGPT, it's very much a dialogue-based system. So you can input a text, ask it to translate it, and then ask it to explain why it translated a particular word in a particular way. And you can ask it, what are some of the other possible ways of translating that particular word? So again, used well, it causes people to become more intellectually engaged in this case with the act of translation and some of the decisions that one makes around translating. Used badly, it makes the user more passive because they just put in a text, get a translation, trust it implicitly that it's a perfect translation, whatever that means. So they haven't developed, they haven't learnt anything, they haven't entered that sort of zone that we were talking about where you have to deliberate as to whether something has been well done or not, whether it's misleading or not, and you have to sort of convince yourself one way or another. So I think if it's used in that way, so that there's real engagement with the output and a real scrutiny of the output, I think it does have benefits.
So if I'm right, if I understand correctly, asking it to translate a text in English into another language and to leave it there can be quite passive because you're not seeing how it's translated, but that you can use ChatGPT to explain how it's translated the text, and that exercise can help you understanding of the act of translating. Would it be useful? Are there any pitfalls to asking it to create a piece of text in the language that you're learning, and then reading that text and seeing how much you understand without translating it, and then translating it and comparing it to the English to see how much you understood? Is that a helpful exercise?
Absolutely, yeah. Because again, it's good to practice reading texts that you haven't read before.
Yeah.
Because again, if you just practice by having a look multiple times at the same text that you're already familiar with, it can make you feel all sort of warm and cozy and at ease. But that's probably not how you'll be feeling during at least part of one of the interviews. You will feel as if you're having to think. You will therefore feel a little bit apprehensive, perhaps, because you're not sure that what you're about to say, is this really insightful, or is this really not particularly relevant? You can often feel a bit uncertain, and so if you generate texts that you haven't seen before, read them through, and then maybe generate the translation to check your understanding. So long as you do that so that you're constantly looking at different texts, so that you're constantly slightly disconcerted, that sort of thing can be good preparation because it recreates the sorts of things that are likely to happen in the interview. And as we said earlier, even if you are doing that working with something like ChatGPT by yourself, it's still good to speak aloud and explain your translation or your analysis of a text. Because if you're just doing that silently in your head, you won't be able to do it silently in your head during the interview, because otherwise the interviewers won't know what you're thinking. So even if you're working one-to-one with ChatGPT or any of the others, still speak aloud, show your workings verbally, because that's an important part of the practice.
Yeah, and am I right in thinking reading text in another language helps you practice understanding those texts in their own language without translating?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, when you're learning languages, really at a fairly early stage, it's good to stop constantly translating. If you're learning, Italian or French or German or something, if every time you encounter a sentence in Italian, French or German, you have to translate it in your head into English in order to understand it, that's a step in the process you want to try and get rid of as soon as possible. You want to be understanding it in Italian or in French or in German without having to constantly silently in your head convert it into English in order to comprehend it.
So someone could slowly build from ChatGPT where they read text in the language they're learning, and then once they've understood some of it, compare it to an English translation, which they can create in ChatGPT, and after they've gained the proficiency, then move on to books where you can't just shove a book in ChatGPT to translate. So you can slowly build up to that.
Exactly.
To that stage. And you were mentioning about practicing the dialogue, which is something key and essential for the interview. Is there in ChatGPT, is there like a speak function where you can practice dialogue, or is it just purely typing in?
No, you can. There's a little microphone button thing, and if you click that, you can speak into it. So again, especially with languages, it's good to practice the speaking, because as we've said, part of the interview will involve speaking in one of the languages, that the applicants have some expertise in. So anything that helps practice, speaking aloud is good. So if you're doing this sort of exercise where you've got ChatGPT to translate something, if you then want to sort of probe its decision-making process behind the translation that it's produced, you can do that by asking it questions in French or in German or in Spanish or whichever language it is that you have real confidence in. And so there you're practicing the speaking element as well as the sort of probing the translation and reflecting upon the translation. So all of that is potentially very useful.